The applause was meant to bury me. "And this dance," my new husband announced, "is for the woman I've loved for 10 years. He ignored me, standing in my $8,000 gown, and offered his hand to my sister, Sophie. The crowd cheered, thinking it was romantic. They didn't know the applause was premature. They didn't know that as they danced. My lawyer was walking through the main doors. My name is Amelia Dawson, and on the night of my wedding, I was the most expensive decoration in the room. The Harborview Grand was suffocating. The air in the Bristol ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and old money, a floral-scented poison. Chandeliers dripped crystals from the ceiling, throwing fractured light onto the faces of 500 guests. These were the elite of our world, partners and rivals of Dawson Precision Medical, the empire my father had built, and I, in my $8,000 custom gown, was the final merger. The fabric was a heavy, suffocating weight on my shoulders, the intricate beadwork feeling less like pearls and more like shackles. My father, Marcus Dawson, was a statue of satisfaction. He stood near the towering ice sculpture, his smile fixed and broad. It was not the smile of a father watching his daughter get married. It was the smile of a CEO who had just successfully closed a hostile takeover. This marriage was a contract, a business deal etched in floral arrangements and champagne, and I was the consideration. My new husband, Liam Sterling, was a masterpiece of charm. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, his hand brushing my back, a gesture that looked protective to the guests but felt to me like a warden's grip. He was beautiful, with a jawline that could cut glass and eyes that promised the world. But when those eyes landed on me, truly landed on me, they were cold, not cruel, not angry, just empty, a chilling, polished void. And then there was Sophie, my sister, the jewel of the Dawson family. She was pouting by the 17-foot-tall champagne tower, looking utterly bored. As the maid of honor, she was a vision in emerald silk, but her beauty was sharp, serrated. She kept sighing, a theatrical display of impatience, her eyes constantly, hungrily, darting to Liam. The clinking of a knife against a crystal flute silenced the room. Liam was on the small stage, microphone in hand, his smile blinding. "I'd like to say a few words," he began, his voice like velvet. The room hung on his every syllable. He spoke of destiny, of finding your one true partner, of a love that had waited patiently. I stood beside him, the perfect bride, my smile painted on. I knew this speech. We had practiced a version of it. "But what people don't know," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, "is that this isn't new. This love has been my anchor for 10 years, a secret love I've held on to." A few guests awed softly. I felt a prickle of confusion. 10 years. We had only met 2 years ago. Then he turned. But he did not turn to me. He turned away from me, his back becoming a wall of black tuxedo fabric. He stepped off the platform, leaving me standing there alone under the spotlight. He walked past my chair, past the bridal table. He walked directly to Sophie. She looked up, her boredom vanishing, replaced by a radiant, triumphant smirk. "And this dance," Liam announced, his voice booming through the speakers as he offered his hand to my sister, "is for the woman I've loved for 10 years. The room exploded, not with gasps, but with applause. Thunderous, deafening applause. They thought it was a performance, a sweet, surprising gesture for the bride's sister, the loyal maid of honor. They thought it was a modern, beautiful moment. The fools. They were applauding my execution." Sophie giggled, a high, silvery sound, and placed her hand in his. They walked onto the polished dance floor. The music, a slow, romantic ballad, swelled to fill the room. Liam pulled her close, their bodies fitting together with a familiarity that screamed the truth. I did not cry. I did not gasp or run. I stood perfectly still, a statue in silk and pearls. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot wave that washed over the room, but I refused to let it burn me. While every eye was on the cheating couple, on the grand romantic lie they were performing, my hand moved, slowly, discreetly. I lifted my wrist, pushing back the lace cuff of my gown. I looked down at the simple, elegant watch my mother had left me. The second hand was sweeping toward the 12. I was not watching the dance. I was watching the time. I was waiting. The music swelled again, a sickly sweet ballad designed to make the guests sigh. Liam dipped Sophie low. His hand splayed possessively on the small of her back, right where the emerald silk clung to her skin. They were lost in their own world, absorbed in their 10-year lie. They were laughing, a private, intimate laugh shared in front of 500 people. The guests, those fools, ate it up. A few even dabbed at their eyes, overcome by the sweetness of the moment. I remained standing by the head table, a ghost in white silk, invisible at my own wedding. My eyes were fixed on the grand oak doors at the far end of the ballroom. My watch, my mother's watch, hit the hour. 9 o'clock. On the dot. The doors burst open. They were not opened politely. They were thrown wide, slamming against the interior walls with a crack that silenced the violins. The music died in an instant, a screech of feedback from the speakers. The figure standing in the doorway was not a guest. She wore no gown. She was a blade in the soft, decadent room. Mrs. Evelyn Reed, my personal attorney, stood in a graphite gray pantsuit tailored so sharply it could have drawn blood. Her heels clicked on the marble floor, a sound like a judge's gavel striking stone. Flanking her, 2 men in identical, severe black suits stepped inside. They were built like bank vaults, and their faces were utterly devoid of emotion. They carried gleaming black briefcases, and their eyes, cold and assessing, scanned the room. The silence in the ballroom was total. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. 500 heads, 500 pairs of eyes, swiveled from the dance floor to the door. Liam and Sophie had frozen, still tangled in their embrace, their expressions a mixture of confusion and profound annoyance at the interruption. My father, Marcus Dawson, was the first to react. He shot to his feet, his face, usually a mask of controlled satisfaction, turning a blotchy, dangerous purple. He jabbed a thick finger toward the entrance. "Security!" he roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "Security, who in the hell allowed this? Get them out of my party!" "Get them out now!" The 2 uniformed guards by the cocktail bar looked at each other, then at my father, and began to move. But they were too slow, too hesitant. They never had a chance. Evelyn Reed ignored them all. She moved with the unstoppable, direct force of a locomotive. She parted the sea of stunned guests, her gaze fixed on the small stage where the band's MC stood, mouth agape, microphone still clutched in his hand. She did not ask for it. She simply took it from his grasp. A soft whine echoed, and then her voice, amplified and as clear and cold as ice, filled every corner of the room. Liam Sterling. She did not shout. She did not need to. The name hung in the air, an indictment. Liam let go of Sophie, taking a protective step in front of her. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked. Evelyn motioned with her chin. The first man in black stepped forward. He walked directly onto the dance floor, reached into his briefcase, and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound by a rubber band. He thrust them into Liam's chest. "Mr. Sterling," the man said, his voice flat, "you have been served." Liam stared at the papers as if they were venomous. Sophie let out a small, nervous laugh. "Is this some kind of joke, Amelia? What is this?" Evelyn's gaze snapped to her. "Sophie Dawson." The second man in black immediately moved, handing an identical stack of papers to my sister, who recoiled, refusing to touch them. He simply dropped them at her feet. "You as well. This is outrageous," my father bellowed, striding forward. "You can't just barge in here." Evelyn turned, her eyes finding Marcus in the crowd. She pointed the microphone at him like a weapon. "And Marcus Dawson." The second man, having retrieved the final thickest packet from his briefcase, strode to the head table. With deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, he placed the documents directly on top of my father's gold-rimmed dinner plate. "This is for you." The room had stopped breathing. This was my cue. I finally moved. I gathered the heavy skirt of my $8,000 gown in one hand. I stepped down from the raised dais, my own heels clicking on the dance floor. I walked past the frozen forms of my husband and my sister. I stopped when I was standing shoulder to shoulder with my lawyer. I looked at the 3 stunned, horrified faces of my family. Then I turned to Evelyn Reed. "Thank you for coming." "Evelyn," I said, my voice clear and steady. They thought the call in the story would be a desperate, tearful plea. They never imagined the call had been made weeks ago. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a summons. The party wasn't my public execution. It was the perfect, inescapable venue to serve them all at once, in front of the entire world that mattered most to them. Evelyn Reed raised the microphone once more, her gaze sweeping over the silent, horrified crowd. She was not addressing them. She was creating a record, a public, undeniable moment of testimony. For the clarification of all present, Evelyn's voice cut through the silence. "My client, Amelia Dawson, is filing for an immediate annulment of her marriage to Liam Sterling on the grounds of fraud." A collective gasp, a ripple of whispers. The word annulment was so much more brutal, so much more final than divorce. It was an erasure. "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, her voice rising in legal, precise cadence, "we are simultaneously filing a civil lawsuit against Mr. Liam Sterling and Ms. Sophie Dawson, jointly, for conspiracy to commit fraud." Liam, who had been staring at the papers in his hand, let out a harsh, barking laugh. It was a terrible, forced sound. "This is insane!" he shouted, throwing the documents onto the dance floor. "She's hysterical." "She's always been unstable. Ask anyone. She's lost her mind." Evelyn didn't even look at him. She simply raised her voice, the microphone amplifying her power. "And a separate action against Marcus Dawson." My father's head snapped up. His eyes, which had been fixed on me with a look of murderous rage, were now wide with genuine shock. "For the charges of—" Evelyn read from a document she had produced from her own briefcase. "Undue influence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and fraudulent conveyance of assets." The room was no longer just silent. It was dead. The air had been sucked out of it. The guests were statues, trapped in a nightmare of social etiquette. My father's partners, the city's elite, were all hearing this. "What is this nonsense?" Marcus finally growled, his voice low and threatening. "What lie has she fed you? Counselor." "What is this about this?" I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was quiet, but in the total silence, it carried. I stepped forward, taking the microphone from Evelyn's hand. "This is about a debt." I looked at my father, then at Liam, then at Sophie, who was trembling beside her lover. "This entire wedding, this," I gestured to the lavish, grotesque room, "was a lie, a very expensive, very desperate lie." I turned to the guests, but my eyes were locked on Marcus. My father orchestrated this marriage for one reason: to gain access to my mother's trust fund, a fund I was granted full control of, as of today, the day of my marriage. I let that sink in. The wheels were turning in their heads. They were connecting the dots. "Why?" I continued. "Because this family," and I said the word family like it was a disease, Is drowning in a debt so massive it threatened to destroy the public image my father holds so dear. A debt of $1.2 million. Someone in the front row, a banking executive, choked on his champagne. 1.2 million, I repeated, letting the number hang in the air. But here is the most interesting part. That debt does not belong to Dawson Precision Medical. It doesn't belong to my father. I turned, my gaze landing on my sister, Sophie. Her face had gone from a victorious smirk to a waxy, pale mask of terror. Her eyes were wide, her breathing shallow. It's her debt, I said, pointing. Sophie's, every single dollar. A gambling debt, as it turns out. Owed to some very unsavory people in Boston who don't appreciate being made to wait. A high-pitched keen, a sound like a dying animal, escaped Sophie's lips. She was going to be ruined, I said, the truth feeling cold and hard on my tongue. And my father, the great Marcus Dawson, could not have his precious jewel exposed as a degenerate gambler. He couldn't risk the scandal, so he devised a plan. He would marry me off. I looked at Liam. He needed an accomplice. Someone charming enough to fool me, and greedy enough to participate. Liam was perfect. He agreed to marry me, knowing the marriage was a sham, on the promise that as soon as I signed the papers, I would be pressured, forced, into using my mother's money to pay Sophie's debt, and he, of course, would get his share for his performance. Liam's face was sheet white. He looked trapped, his eyes darting between me, Marcus, and the exits. He was a cornered animal. My father was no longer purple with rage. He was a statue of pure, frozen fury, his face a terrifying, bloodless white. But Sophie just stared at me. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The room began to spin around her. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Her knees buckled. With a dramatic, sickening thud, she crumpled to the polished floor, her emerald gown pooling around her like a shroud. She was out cold. Sophie's collapse was the breaking point. The veneer of civilization shattered. The word ambulance was whispered, then shouted. Guests, who just minutes before were sipping champagne, now stampeded for the exits, their faces pale with the delicious, horrified scandal of it all. They were birds fleeing a forest fire, desperate not to be associated with the wreckage. Amid the chaos of medics rushing in with a gurney and chairs being overturned, my father, Marcus, finally moved. He ignored the EMTs bustling around his fainted jewel. He ignored Liam, who was backed against the stage looking like a trapped animal. He walked directly to me. His face was a mask of such pure, cold hatred that it was barely human. He did not yell. He spoke in a low, vicious hiss that was more terrifying than any scream. "You are finished," he breathed, the words smelling of expensive scotch and bile. "You think this is a victory. You just signed your own death warrant. You destroyed this family." He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into the delicate lace, bruising the skin beneath. "You are not my daughter. Do you hear me? You are nothing. You do not exist." I looked down at his thick, manicured hand on my arm. Then I looked back up into his eyes, and I felt nothing. The fear he had cultivated in me for 25 years was gone, burned away by the truth. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply, calmly, reached over with my free hand and peeled his fingers off my arm, one by one. "You should be more concerned with your own accommodations, Marcus," I said, my voice as calm as if I were discussing the weather. "You have 48 hours to vacate the mansion. Pack your things." He froze, his hand still suspended in the air. "What did you say?" "The mansion," I repeated, "is not yours. It was never yours. It belongs to the heiress trust, my mother's trust, and as of today, I am the sole executor. You are a guest. You have been a guest for 15 years. Your visit is over. You have 48 hours, or I will have you removed for trespassing. You are living in my house." The shock on his face was my first, small, true victory. He had been so focused on the $1.2 million debt that he had forgotten about the $10 million asset he lived in. He had never, in his entire life, believed I had the intelligence or the spine to read the fine print. He stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time, not as a daughter, but as an adversary. The next morning, the adrenaline was gone, replaced by a cold, metallic clarity. I left the hotel I had booked under a false name and went to my personal bank, the branch I had used since I was 16. I slid my card into the ATM. Card invalid. I went inside. The branch manager, Mr. Harris, a man who had sent me birthday cards for a decade, could not meet my eyes. "Miss Dawson," he said, wringing his hands, "there appears to be a hold on your accounts." "A hold? What kind of hold?" "A full freeze, initiated by the primary account holder on your business line. My father. Of course, my checking, my savings, every liquid asset I had was tied to Dawson Precision Medical. With a single phone call, Marcus had cut my lifeline. At the same time, my phone buzzed. An email from Human Resources. "Dear Ms. Dawson, this email is to confirm your immediate termination of employment." I was fired. I was penniless, but I was not broken. He had cut off the infected limb. He did not know I still had the heart. I still had the trust. I took a cab to the private wealth management office that oversaw my mother's estate. I was, after all, in full control now. The freezing of my personal accounts was a vicious, petty annoyance, but the trust was the real power. The senior wealth manager, a woman I had never met, called me into her vast, silent office. She looked pained. "Ms. Dawson, Amelia, there is a significant problem." "My father cannot touch this trust," I said, my confidence unwavering. "The bylaws are ironclad." "It is not your father, Ms. Dawson," she said, her voice soft with pity. "The trust fund, the heiress trust. It has been frozen, as of 7 this morning." My blood ran cold. "How? That's impossible. I am the sole executor." "Yes," she said, visibly uncomfortable. "But you are also a married woman. The petition for a protective injunction was filed less than 12 hours ago by your husband, Mr. Liam Sterling." I couldn't speak. She continued, "Mr. Sterling, in his legal capacity as your spouse, has filed a petition claiming you are mentally unstable. He claims you are suffering a severe psychological breakdown, that you are being manipulated by your attorney, and that you are in immediate danger to your own financial well-being. A judge, seeing the public nature of last night's events, and Mr. Sterling's deep concern for his new bride, granted an emergency hold pending a competency hearing. He had acted the moment he was served. While I was confronting my father, while I was checking into a hotel, he was with his own lawyers, spinning the narrative. He was not just a con man. He was a strategist. I was not just disowned. I was not just fired. I was, in the eyes of the law, a crazy woman. And I had absolutely nothing. The reality of my situation hit me in the gray, unforgiving light of Evelyn Reed's conference room. "They've filed the injunction in family court," Evelyn said. Her fingers steepled. She looked tired. She had not slept. "They have Liam's testimony, as your grieving and concerned husband, and a preliminary affidavit from a psychiatrist he must have had on retainer. They are painting you as a vindictive, unstable woman who had a psychotic break at her own wedding." "But it's all lies," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Yes," Evelyn agreed, her voice flat. "But lies take time and money to disprove. Time and money you no longer have." The truth was stark. Evelyn was working pro bono, a favor, but she couldn't fund a protracted war against the Dawson Precision legal team and my husband's new, high-priced counsel. The injunction meant the trust was locked. Without the trust, I couldn't pay Evelyn. Without Evelyn, I couldn't unlock the trust. I couldn't evict my father from my mother's house. I couldn't do anything. I was checkmated in 3 moves. I left her office. The 24-hour news cycle was already feasting on the scraps of my life. I was a socialite joke, a headline, a cautionary tale. I had $23 in my purse, the last of the cash I'd had on me. I was wearing the same coat I'd worn to my wedding rehearsal. I was a Dawson, and I was, for all intents and purposes, homeless. My friends. They were Marcus's friends, Liam's friends. They were partners in the firm, wives of the men on the board. My phone had been silent for 36 hours. My calls went to voicemail. I was radioactive. I stood at the bus station, the smell of diesel fumes and desperation filling my lungs. I was trying to think, to find one corner of my life that Marcus hadn't touched, that he hadn't built, owned, or corrupted, and then, a memory, faint, like a pressed flower, a small woman with hands that always smelled of chamomile lotion and antibacterial soap, a woman my father had banned from our house after my mother died, calling her a low-class crone. Aunt Clara, my mother's sister. I used my last $20 to buy a one-way ticket to Woonsocket. It felt like another country. I left the gleaming coastal arrogance of Bristol behind and traveled inland to the forgotten red-brick mill towns that history had left behind. She lived in a third-floor walk-up in a building that had been old 50 years ago. The hallways were narrow, the air thick with the smell of boiled dinners and old dust. It was the antithesis of the Harborview Grand, of the mansion, of my entire life. I climbed the sagging stairs, my designer heels clicking on the linoleum, and knocked. The door opened a crack, held by a brass chain. A pair of sharp, intelligent eyes peered out. Then the chain rattled, and the door swung open. Aunt Clara, a retired nurse, was smaller than I remembered, her gray hair in a tight bun, her posture as straight as a steel rod. She looked at me, standing on her worn welcome mat, a refugee from a life of privilege. She took in my expensive coat, the exhaustion, the raw panic in my eyes. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look pitiful. She just held the door wide. "Well," she said, her voice raspy, "it took you long enough. Get in, child." Her apartment was tiny, but it was warm, and it was immaculately clean. Books were stacked on every available surface. She handed me a heavy mug of black tea, so strong it was almost bitter. She didn't ask me what happened. She seemed to already know the shape of it. "He was always a monster," she said, sitting across from me in a worn armchair. "Your mother knew it. She always said Marcus was a demon wrapped in a $1,000 suit." I looked down into my tea. "Then why did she stay?" I whispered, the question I had never been allowed to ask. If she knew what he was, why did she stay with him? Why did she leave me there? Aunt Clara leaned forward, her gaze intense, cutting through my self-pity. "Oh, Amelia," she said, her voice dropping. "That's the story he's been telling you, but it's not the truth." "What truth?" "Your mother wasn't staying. Eris was planning to leave. She was planning to take you, and she was going to burn him to the ground on her way out. She had a plan. She had her own money, a private reserve, a secret place. She was just waiting for the right moment." A cold dread crept up my spine. "What? What happened?" "He happened," Clara said, her voice flat. "But she was smart. She was always smarter than him." Clara's eyes drifted to a small wooden box on her bookshelf. "She died before she could take you, but she left. Precautions." Aunt Clara got up from her armchair and walked to the small, worn wooden box on her bookshelf. She opened it and took something out. She pressed it into my palm. It was heavy, ornate, and cold a brass skeleton key, greened with age. "Your mother gave this to me about a week before she died," Clara said, her voice low. "She told me, if anything happens, Clara, you hold this. Give it to Amelia, but only when she's ready. Only when she's ready to know the truth of what she's running from. Clara closed my fingers around the key. I think, she said, her sharp eyes meeting mine. You're ready. The key didn't go to a bank vault. It went to an apartment. A small, unassuming unit in Pawtucket, a town over, in a massive 19th century textile mill that had been converted into lofts, the kind of place my father would have bulldozed, not visited. Clara gave me the last of her bus money. I stood in front of the building, a vast canyon of red brick and black-paned factory windows, Unit 4B. I slid the heavy key into the lock. It was stiff, protesting, the metal grating as it turned for what felt like the first time in a decade. The door opened with a sigh of stale air. It was a time capsule. I stepped in, and I was not in Pawtucket. I was in the past. Everything was exactly as it had been left 15 years ago, on the day my mother died. A fine layer of dust covered every surface, a gray shroud that had preserved the scene beneath. It smelled faintly of old, dried roses and the ghost of my mother's perfume. Arpege, a scent I had almost forgotten. The light from the enormous factory window illuminated a life I never knew she had. This was her place, not the cold marble mausoleum Marcus Dawson had built, but this small, warm, personal space. It was filled with the things my father had systematically purged from our home, the things he despised. Bookshelves, built from simple pine, overflowed with texts on botany and horticulture. Herbaria, with pressed, dried flowers, were stacked on a table. Canvases were propped against the wall, some blank, others filled with her beautiful, delicate watercolors of plants and landscapes. This was the woman he had called a frivolous amateur. This was the woman he had tried to erase. Here, she had been happy. I could feel it. This was her sanctuary, her escape pod. I sank onto a small, dust-covered sofa. For an hour, I just breathed in the air of the only real home my mother had ever had. But I wasn't there for nostalgia. I was there for a lifeline. Evelyn's words echoed in my head. Lies take time and money to disprove. I had to find what my mother had been planning. What was her leverage? What was she going to use to burn him to the ground? I began to search. I looked for a safe, a hidden panel, anything. I went through the books, shaking them out, hoping for a hidden letter. Nothing. In the corner, there was a simple dark wood writing desk. It was clean, almost sterile, compared to the rest of the room. I tried the drawers. The top two opened easily, filled with sketching pencils, dried ink bottles, and blank paper. The bottom drawer, a deep, wide file drawer, was locked. I took the brass key Clara had given me. It slid into the keyhole, but it wouldn't turn. It was the wrong lock. This was a smaller, more modern keyhole, the kind you'd find on a cabinet or a cash box. My heart sank. I had come all this way for nothing. I was locked out, just as I had been from the trust. I leaned against the desk in frustration, my head in my hands. My eyes fell on the only personal item, the only photograph, in the entire apartment. It sat on the corner of the desk, its simple silver frame covered in dust. I picked it up. It was a picture of me. I was 6 years old, missing my 2 front teeth, holding up a fistful of dandelions. I was sitting on my mother's lap in a garden. We were both laughing, our heads thrown back in the sun. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy, a moment from a life before I knew what a monster looked like. I stared at the image, at the gap-toothed, happy child I had been. My fingers traced the outline of the cheap, tarnished frame. I felt something, a small lump, on the back. I turned the frame over. The velvet backing was old and faded. Taped to it, hidden from view, was a tiny, silvery key, the kind one might use for a diary, or a small lockbox, or a desk drawer. My hand trembled so violently I could barely fit the key into the lock. The old tape had left a sticky brown residue on the metal. I fumbled it, dropping it onto the dusty floor. I snatched it back up, my breath catching in my throat, and forced myself to be steady. I jammed the key into the small keyhole of the desk drawer. A soft, satisfying click echoed in the silent apartment. I pulled the handle. The drawer slid open with a smooth, heavy glide. It was not filled with old letters or photographs. It was packed with the precise, cold tools of an investigation. On top, there was a thick, dark green, hard-bound accountant's ledger. Beneath it, nestled in a small cardboard box, were 6 identical USB flash drives, each neatly labeled with a small white sticker. This was it. This was my mother's arsenal. She had not been planning to leave with an emotional plea. She had been planning to leave with a bomb. I opened the ledger, my mother's handwriting, but it was not the elegant, looping script she used for thank you notes. This was a different version of her, a woman I had never met. The writing was a sharp, angry, meticulous print. It was a shadow ledger, a record of my father's real business. Page after page, she had chronicled the secret life of Dawson Precision Medical. She had cross-referenced internal shipping manifests with my father's private calendars and company expense reports. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. The truth was so much worse than I could have imagined. My father's company wasn't just successful. It was a criminal enterprise. My mother had highlighted specific entries. Shipment 404B, pacemaker units, Lot 12, internal reason code, cosmetic flaw, case scratching. Booked in accounts as destroyed inventory loss. Actual status, sold and shipped to Manila, Philippines via shell distributor. Another. Shipment 81C, coronary stents, Lot 7. Internal reason code, failed sterile seal integrity test. Booked as destroyed. Actual status, sold and shipped to Lagos, Nigeria. The blood drained from my face. This was not a tax dodge. These were not cosmetically flawed items. These were recalled unsafe, non-sterile medical devices. They were failures. They were garbage. They were lethal. My father, the great philanthropist Marcus Dawson, was knowingly shipping life-threatening, defective medical parts to the poorest and most desperate people in the world. He was selling them death, booking it as a loss, and then, as the other side of the ledger showed, collecting millions in secret profits. This was not a domestic dispute. This was a massive, international, fraudulent, and dangerous criminal operation. Sophie's $1.2 million debt was nothing. It was a rounding error. This was a $100 million empire of fraud. My hands were shaking again, but with rage, not fear. I looked at the USB drives. My mother had labeled them 2, Cayman, Act 1, Zurich, Primary, Panama, Inflow. This was the money trail. The offshore accounts where the money from the destroyed inventory was being laundered. My mother had built the entire case, but something didn't add up. Where was Liam in all this? Was he really just a bit player, a charming fool roped in to solve Sophie's little gambling problem? It felt too small, too insignificant, for a man my father would trust to marry his daughter. I turned to the back of the ledger. The last few pages were not lists of shipments, but of payouts. Discretionary payments, Panama. There were dozens of entries, transfers, dates, and then, taped to the very last page, was a single printed document. It was a copy of a bank authorization form, a wire transfer for $250,000 from the Panama account to an untraceable number in Zurich. It was a standard authorization form for a high-level offshore account. It required 2 signatures. The first, as expected, was Marcus Dawson. I read the name on the second signature line, the co-signer. The co-owner of the primary money laundering account, Liam Sterling. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. It was like being punched in the chest. He was not a new addition. He was not a pawn. He was a partner. He had been my father's right-hand man in this entire operation for years. He was the charming, handsome face who managed the offshore logistics, the international partner. Sophie's debt wasn't the reason for the marriage. It was a distraction, a convenient, smaller con to mask the real gargantuan crime, the wedding. It wasn't a bonus. It wasn't a reward for helping out with Sophie. It was a merger. My father was ensuring his criminal partner was legally and permanently tied to the family, giving him control, keeping him loyal. I wasn't just a key to a trust fund. I was the final binding seal on their criminal pact. I was the prize, the trophy to be passed from one monster to the other. My mother had known. She had seen it all. And she had methodically collected the evidence to stop it. I left the Pawtucket loft at dawn, the ledger and the USB drives in a worn backpack I'd bought at a thrift store. It felt like I was carrying a block of uranium. It was heavy, it was toxic, and it was the only power I had. I took the bus to Evelyn's office, using the back entrance. We sat in her darkened conference room, the blinds drawn. I didn't speak. I simply opened the ledger and pushed it across the table. I placed the 6 USB drives next to it. Evelyn read. She was silent for a long time. The color drained from her face, leaving a pale, waxy sheen. She flipped a page, then another. She looked at the USB labels. When she finally looked up at me, the pity was gone. The civil suit was gone. This was something else. "Amelia," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This isn't fraud. This is monstrous. We're not in family court anymore. This is federal. This is international." "It's Liam," I said, my voice dead. "He's a partner, not a pawn. He's a co-conspirator in what could be thousands of deaths," Evelyn said, her legal mind racing, connecting the dots. Defective pacemakers, failed stents. My God, we need to be strategic. We can't trust the local police. Marcus has them on his payroll. We need the FBI, perhaps the Southern District of New York. "What do we do?" I asked. "We prepare," she said, her eyes hardening. "We clone these drives. We put the ledger in a secure vault. We prepare a whistleblower file for the Department of Justice. This is the case of a lifetime, and it's terrifying. But we never got the chance to prepare. We thought we were the hunters. We didn't realize the trap had already been sprung. The next morning, the attack came. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was an execution of my character. My father didn't just have money. He had influence, woven into the very fabric of New England. He sat on the board of the largest newspaper in Providence. I saw the headline through the window of a corner store, splashed across the front page, above the fold. My face, an unflattering paparazzi shot from the wedding, was next to it. Unstable heiress and a vengeful lie. Amelia Dawson's mental collapse threatens hundreds of jobs. My blood ran cold. I bought a copy. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. It was Liam's injunction, weaponized for the public. The article was filled with quotes, painting me not as a victim, but as a deranged, spoiled child. Former colleagues from Dawson Precision people I had known for years were quoted anonymously. Of course. "We were all deeply concerned," one said. "Amelia had become erratic, obsessive. We were worried about her." Another. "She was under immense pressure. We never thought she would go this far, fabricating such terrible lies to hurt her family and the company that supports so many people." But the masterstroke was the expert. A Dr. Alistair Finch, described as a leading clinical psychologist, spoke at length without ever having met me. "While I cannot discuss any specific individual," he was quoted, "this kind of public theatrical outburst is often a textbook sign of severe histrionic personality disorder, a deep-seated history of instability, combined with a vindictive, obsessive-compulsive narrative. These individuals are often highly manipulative. They weren't just calling me crazy. They were making me the criminal. They were painting my father as the victim, a stoic leader protecting his company, his family, and his hundreds of jobs from his own, tragically ill daughter. and they had used my own lawyer against me. The article's final, venomous paragraph. Sources close to the family express concern that Ms. Dawson is being actively manipulated by a shady and overly aggressive attorney, Evelyn Reed, who may be exploiting the heiress's fragile mental state for her own financial gain. I ran back to Evelyn's office. The newspaper crumpled in my fist. "They're attacking you now," I said, shoving it onto her desk. "Evelyn, they're calling you a manipulator." She was standing by her window, her back to me, holding her phone. She looked pale, but her spine was rigid. "They already did more than that. Amelia," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "What do you mean?" She turned around. "I received a call 15 minutes ago, from the State Bar Association, effective 9 this morning." My stomach dropped. "Evelyn, no." 4 separate, anonymous ethics complaints were filed against me in the last 12 hours, she said, her voice hollow. "Improper conduct, manipulating a vulnerable client, breach of fiduciary duty, coercion. They used Liam's injunction as the basis. They are claiming I am the one who forced you into this delusional state. But we can fight it. We have the ledger." "It doesn't matter," she said, placing her phone on the desk. "My license to practice law has been temporarily suspended, pending a full investigation. I can't represent you. I can't file anything. I can't even legally advise you." The trap had closed. I was utterly, completely alone. I was a crazy woman with no job, no money, and no lawyer. I stood there, holding a backpack filled with the explosive truth, and there was not a single person in the world who would listen to me. I was a ghost. For 2 weeks, I haunted the back rooms of Aunt Clara's tiny wound-socket apartment, living on instant noodles and stale tea. I was the city's #1 pariah, the unstable heiress, a phantom in the tabloids. My father had put a price on my head, not in money, but in public scorn. Any friend, any associate, anyone who helped me would be next. Evelyn, my only shield, had been disarmed. I was completely, terrifyingly on my own. The backpack containing the ledger and drives felt like a tumor I was carrying. It was all the proof I needed, and it was utterly useless. Who could I take it to? The local police, who my father had dinner with every first Thursday of the month, the state attorney, who was a guest at the wedding. I was a certified lunatic with no lawyer, accusing one of the state's most powerful men. I would be committed before I even opened the book. My father and Liam had built a fortress of lies, and I was screaming from the outside, unheard. Desperation clawed at me. I was out of options. I had to go back. I had to believe my mother had left me more. If she knew about the fraud, what else did she know? What was she so afraid of that she built an entire secret life, an escape plan, a case file against her own husband? I snuck out of Clara's building before dawn and took the bus back to Pawtucket. The air in the loft was colder this time, the dust thicker. The silence felt heavy, accusing. I had failed her. I had her evidence, and I had done nothing. I tore the place apart. I ripped open the sofa cushions. I pulled the books from their shelves, shaking each one. I tapped on the walls, the floorboards, looking for a hollow sound. Nothing. There was nothing. Exhausted, I collapsed at the small writing desk. I was beaten. They had won. My gaze fell on the single silver frame, the picture of me, 6 years old, laughing with my mother, the only personal, sentimental object in this entire room of evidence, the picture that had hidden the key. Why here, I thought? Why hide the key to the evidence with this? It was a clue. It had to be. My mother had been methodical. Every book in this room was about botany. Every canvas was a landscape. Only this one small picture, was about us. I picked it up. My fingers fumbled with the small metal tabs on the back of the frame, bending them back. I pulled out the thick cardboard backing. It was just a piece of gray, fibrous board. My heart sank. No. I looked again. The board felt too thick. It was 2 pieces, pressed together. I slid my fingernail between them. It was a false back. Tucked inside, folded into a tiny, tight square, was a single sheet of paper. It was brittle. The cheap printer paper yellowed at the creases. It was not a letter. It was not a diary. It was a printed email. I unfolded it. The date was October 12th, 15 years ago, 2 days before she died. The sender was Dr. Robert Evans, her primary care physician. The subject line hit me like a physical blow. Subject re. Your recent lab results, urgent. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the text. Heiress, it began. I cannot stress this enough. You must come to my office immediately. The results of the toxicology screen we ran last week just came back. The preliminary findings? Heiress. This is not a coincidence. Your symptoms, the dizziness, the vertigo, the arrhythmia, the panic attacks you've been having are not related to your known heart condition. They are classic, textbook signs of chronic digitalis toxicity. I didn't understand the words. I read on, my blood turning to ice. To be blunt, your body is showing critically high, non-therapeutic levels of digoxin. This is a powerful heart medication, Heiress, and I know for a fact you are not, and have never been, prescribed this drug. Someone is giving this to you. This is not an accident. This is poisoning. You need to go to the hospital and you need to call the police. Now. Poisoning. Poisoning. The room, the silent, dusty apartment, suddenly felt airless. My mother had not died of a weak heart, as my father had told everyone. She had not succumbed to her frailties. She had been murdered. And then, the final horrific piece of the puzzle slammed into my mind. It was a memory, sharp and sudden, like a shard of glass in my brain. The last few months of my mother's life. She was weak, always in her chambers, resting. She had so many pills. My father was too busy. I was too young. But someone was always there. Someone was always helping. Someone was always walking up the stairs, a gentle smile on her face, carrying a tray. I brought you some tea, Heiress. I've organized your medications for you. Don't you worry. You just rest. I'll take care of everything. A young, doting, helpful girl, always eager to please her stepmother. It was Sophie. It had always been Sophie. She wasn't just a gambler. She wasn't just a cheat. She was a killer. She had been poisoning my mother, her stepmother, for months, drip by drip, dose by dose. Why? Because she knew my mother was building the case. She knew my mother was going to expose Marcus. She had to stop her. She had to protect her father, her position, her inheritance. She had to ensure the monster stayed in control. I fell back. The email clutched in my hand, and I finally, truly, understood the depths of the evil I was fighting. The ledger was a ticking bomb, and the toxicology report was the detonator. I knew I had one chance. The local police were a dead end. My father owned them, but he didn't own everyone. I found him through a series of encrypted emails. David Finch. He'd been a top-tier investigative reporter for the Boston Globe, but a fallout with a powerful senator had left him disgraced, fired, and running a 2-bit podcast out of his basement. He was angry. He was brilliant, and he had nothing left to lose. He was perfect. I sent him one line. I have proof that Marcus Dawson is an international criminal, and I can prove he's a murderer. He met me on a park bench. I showed him the email. I showed him one page of the ledger. His eyes, cynical and tired, lit up. The old hunger was still there. We set the stage. I, the unstable heiress, would make one last desperate attempt at a truce. I contacted my father's lawyers, claiming I was destitute, terrified, and willing to exchange my mother's delusional papers for a simple, quiet settlement. I just wanted my life back. I'd cried. They agreed, their arrogance palpable. They were coming to snuff out the last ember. The meeting place. My request. The main ballroom of the Harborview Grand. The scene of my humiliation. It was poetic, and they were too arrogant to see the trap. David and his single cameraman were hidden on the minstrel's balcony, overlooking the vast, empty room. It was cold, the opulent chandeliers unlit, the air stale. They arrived, Marcus, Liam, and Sophie, flanked by a team of 3 smug $1,000-an-hour lawyers. "Amelia," Marcus said, his voice dripping with false paternal concern, "I am glad you've seen reason. This can all go away." "Show us the documents your mother left," one of the lawyers said, holding out a manicured hand. I placed the heavy green ledger on the table. "This is it." The lawyers pounced, opening it, their eyes scanning the meticulous records. Liam and Marcus stood behind them, watching. Sophie hung back, looking nervous, her eyes darting around the empty, cavernous room. As the lawyers murmured, their faces slowly turning from smugness to confusion and then alarm. I walked slowly toward my sister. "It's an impressive room, isn't it?" I said, my voice quiet. Sophie started, her gaze snapping to me. "What? The Harborview Grand? So many memories." I stopped, just a few feet from her. Liam and Marcus were now engrossed in the ledger, their heads bent in low, urgent conversation with their legal team. They couldn't hear me. "I just have one question." "Sophie," I said, my voice as light as air. "I'm just curious. Was it hard watching her die?" She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just froze. A perfect, beautiful statue of ice. I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. "The tea," I said. "The pills. Day after day. Watching her get weaker. Did she ever look at you? Did she ever suspect it was you?" "Stop it!" she hissed, her eyes wide with panic. Liam and Marcus finally looked up, sensing the shift in the air. "What is this?" Marcus growled. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the folded, yellowed email. I didn't hand it to him. I threw it. It fluttered, landing on the open ledger, the toxicology report. Sophie saw the name Dr. Evans, and she broke. She let out a shriek, a raw, primal sound that echoed in the vast hall. "She was going to ruin us!" she screamed, her face contorting. "You don't understand. She was going to send Dad to prison. She found the accounts. She was going to destroy everything." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "She was weak. She deserved to die." The confession hung in the air, sickening and absolute. The lawyers' faces were paper white. Liam, realizing in an instant the chasm he had fallen into, the difference between white-collar fraud and first-degree murder, immediately turned on my father. "I had no part in this," he yelled, backing away, his hands up. This is them. The fraud. That was Marcus. All of it. I never touched her. I never knew anything about this. "You bastard!" Marcus roared, his face purple. He saw it all, his entire world, his empire, his legacy, evaporating in an instant. It was all gone, and he knew who had done it. He looked at me, his eyes no longer human. "You!" he screamed. "You did this. You killed us. You killed us all." He lunged, his hands outstretched, his fingers curled into claws, aiming for my throat. He never made it. "Mr. Dawson," a voice boomed from the balcony. David Finch stepped into the light, his camera lens glinting. "We're live." At the exact same moment, the grand oak doors of the ballroom burst open, slamming against the walls, just as they had at the wedding. But it wasn't Evelyn alone this time. She stood there, her license reinstated, a look of grim triumph on her face. And flanking her were not 2 men in suits, but 6. They wore blue windbreakers with 3, bold, yellow letters on the back, F.B.I. "Marcus Dawson," Evelyn said, her voice ringing with the final beautiful sound of justice. "Liam Sterling, you are both under arrest for conspiracy and international wire fraud." An agent stepped forward, pulling Marcus off me, while another grabbed the still babbling Liam. "And her," I pointed at Sophie, who had crumpled to the floor. "Her for the murder of heiress Dawson." A federal agent looked at Evelyn, who nodded. "Add murder in the first degree to the list for Ms. Dawson," the agent said, pulling out a third pair of cuffs. It was over. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and give it a massive boost by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this.